Badlands of Badlands. Explain those Badlands.
Good evening. Today is Black Monday, the day the Dow dropped more than 500 points. Today the Dow dropped more than 22%.
It's panic. Everybody was trying to find a bottom.
1929. But this crash in 1987 is not just an American experience. Around the world, stock markets fell faster than a skydiver without a parachute.
What we have to confront is a deep, systemic, and structural restructuring of our world. And this will take some time. And the world will look differently after we have gone through this transition process.
For centuries, they've been stuffing their stomachs with human flesh, and they've been stuffing their pockets with money. But they must realize that this bowl of vampires is about to end. But the common people of these countries in their heart, they can feel what's happening. They can see our struggle for our independence, for our true sovereignty. And they see this connection with their aspirations to be truly independent, which is exacerbated by the fact that in the Western elites there is a strong desire to freeze the current unfair state of things in international affairs.
Well, let me tell you something, brother. When they took a shot at my hero, and they tried to kill the next President of the United States, enough was enough. And I said, let Trumpomania run wild, brother. Let Trumpomania rule again. Let Trumpomania make America great again.
People who don't believe are walking dead. They are asleep. And this is the awakening.
All right. Welcome to everybody, the Book of Trump. This is chapter 12. And tonight I'm going to be joined by, as you can see, Burning Bright. BB, what's up?
The ghost of Burning Bright, I think, at this point in time. Yeah. Out with the baby tonight, out with the wife, and trying to be normal people, and you know how it goes.
Took the baby around town?
Yep. Out of the town. He was tearing it up, ripping and tearing. Before and I apologize for being late. My internet dropped out like right before we were supposed to go live, so I had to reset my router. I hope I'm coming through clear. My computer's been like on the fritz. I talked to Brad today. I'm gonna try to order a new laptop this week. It's probably past due to do that. I probably honestly I think I have like so many videos saved on my computer from the from the brief. Like I have to always download little videos to put in the news brief, and they're all just like cached in like a folder. So I went through and deleted like 3 gigs of videos right while I was waiting for my router to reset. That's probably it.
Yeah, so that could be it. That could be the laptop. Could be the internet. Who knows? But yeah, let's hit a sponsor, and we will let's hit 2 sponsors because we got actually first we have Gart Plymouth. And so Badlands Media is headed to Plymouth, Massachusetts, where near where Burning Bright lives, with the 8th stop on the Great American Restoration Tour, May 1st through 4th. Don't miss out on the conversations and shenanigans. Get your virtual tickets today. With virtual tickets, ensure you are part of the action wherever you may be. You'll gain access to an exclusive Gart chat to interact with other in-person and virtual attendees. Get behind-the-scenes photos and videos. Get to ask the panel questions so you can be part of the live discussion. And while many of our show hosts are at the conference, you may notice some changes to our regularly scheduled programming. Get your fix of Badlands Media by purchasing your virtual ticket today. And if you can't watch live, don't fret. Replays of the entire event will be available to all ticket holders. Visit badlandsmedia.tv/events for details on both in-person and virtual tickets. Sweets.
Damn
so yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
2 weeks, 3 weeks, less than
2
3 weeks away.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to believe it's like that fast since Vegas, because Vegas feels like it wasn't that long ago. But it'll be fun, man. I don't know if I've ever actually really been up to Massachusetts. So
it's good stuff. I'm hoping we had a good day today. We've had awful weather. For the winter was awful, and then the spring has been awful. It's been fake spring. But today was sunny, 65 degrees. We cruised along the beach. You know, you got to get Baby Bright, the rum runners. He's all about those.
Nice.
Feeling like it's summer. So,
it's probably good
rum under the gums. Exactly.
Good for the teething.
You're going to bring the teeth in, so you know, stick a little bit of the Kraken rum on there. Get him ready for summer. And I told his mother he's going to be chasing those biddies around the beach town soon enough.
Strong play. It's a very strong play.
He's a handsome boy.
I highly condone. All right, let's be interrupted real quick.
You're still looking good.
I'm still feeling good. You know, I've got all your MyPillow products. Mattress topper, bed sheets, MyPillows, towels, slippers, blankets.
I'm interrupted this commercial to do something I've never done before. Get 2 MyPillows absolutely free on orders of $100 or more. I can't do this forever, so get on board with this great sale today. Our best-selling 6-piece bath towel sets or kitchen towel sets, just $29.98. Our famous standard MyPillows only $14.98. Queens $18.98. King size only $1 more. Body pillows $29.98. Multi-use MyPillow 2.0s with pillowcase $9.98. Save $40 on our Spring Percale and Giza Dream bedsheet sets. Any size, any color. So go to MyPillow.com or call that number on your screen. Use your promo code to save up to 80% on all MyPillow products. And when you spend $100 or more, get 2 standard MyPillows absolutely free.
All right. Got that Giza cotton. Not the Gaza cotton, but the Giza cotton.
Right.
Which
I love Lindell's commercial where he interrupts himself. That's like the prime peak Lindell.
Yeah, absolute inception. And I mean, frankly, the Giza region might become relevant to this whole Middle East thing soon enough. So you know, sit tight.
Get those sheets while you can get them.
Get that cotton while you can.
Yeah, I don't know if Lindell will be offering the deals on them very much longer.
Awesome. Well, yeah. So. I mean, I'm sure everyone watching this, or most people watching this, probably may have caught the narrative last week where you and I did like a 4-hour conversation on the Sovereign Alliance.
Right.
And we were going to do this episode last week, but it didn't really make a lot of sense. We were both kind of burnt out. And after doing 4 hours on Sovereign Alliance, it probably didn't make sense for us to come back the next day and do like 2 more hours on Putin. But,
right.
But yeah, that was a great conversation, and it does kind of prime this conversation. And then last night, your show, The Oak, was awesome.
I had Oak McCulloch on there last night, and we talked about leadership, which is his, that's his main kind of topic that he discusses in a lot of the talks he does. But, one of my favorite things on a lot of these shows, and especially what I try to do on the narrative, is lay out a broad agenda, but then we rabbit trail. So we were talking about George Patton, we were talking about Kennedy and Trump and just styles of leadership. But yeah, if you guys want to check out, if anybody missed it, the narrative episode 17 as well, 2 weeks ago, as Ghost said, was the Sovereign Alliance. And so this is going to be more of a deep dive on the Russian leg of that alliance. Yeah, it's good stuff. It's funny. I think you've done quite a bit of writing as well. I've done a lot of writing, and we just assume that like everybody has gone through all of this stuff because we mention it in asides. But I think that episode of the narrative was eye-opening. I was reading a lot of comments and got a lot of feedback and everything that, a lot of people don't. Like they've got the surface level. They know we talk about these alliances, but I think it's worthwhile kind of revisiting a lot of our original theories and fleshing them out. And I think we find, John, I know, did this with devolution in the last year or so, that when we go back through our own theories, we start to, remember certain things, and then it looks a different way when we look at it now.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, for the when you watch the intro to this show, you may recognize the music because it's the music from Days of Thunder.
Yeah,
it's the theme from Days of Thunder, which is when I heard it, I was like, it might have actually been when I watched it for y'all's show. And I was like, oh, that's a catchy little theme song, and then I was able to clip it for that. But the person speaking is not Donald Trump; it's actually Vladimir Putin, and it's a real interview that he gave. I actually went back and had AI redo it because the overdub, the English overdub they did was like an American accent, and it sounded awful. And I was like, this is bullshit. We need a Russian accent AI. So I had AI go back and do it in a Russian accent. But that's exactly what he said. He said exactly that. And when I was listening to it, I was like, that he's describing the Sovereign Alliance. He's describing what you and I talked about last week. And you can see all the visuals on screen as that's playing. That the show is called The Book of Trump because Trump is kind of the organizing spine, so to speak, of the whole agenda. But the show is really about so much more than Trump. It's about Putin as much as it is about Trump, really, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, this is you've set me up. You may not even realize it, but you've set me up to talk about the Lord of the Rings. And as I was in the Badlands chat, Ghost can tell you. You guys think I'm joking. Ghost can tell you that 2 a.m. last night, everybody thinks I'm tucked in bed or I'm doing some research or something like that. And what I'm actually doing is mansplaining the Lord of the Rings to Ash in the Badlands chat. Ghost can corroborate 2 unnamed sources close to the situation. But in all seriousness, the Book of Trump idea, I like that you go into these other directions, because one of the points that I often make about the Fellowship of the Ring is that in the hands of a good writer, there might be a lead. There's probably a prime fulcrum character on which the plot kind of tilts, but you need the other characters to help define the plot and define the battle space and define a lot of the themes. So in the Fellowship, I often will read people that don't understand Tolkien that are like, what did this character even do besides kill some stuff? And everybody there, every member of the Fellowship defines a specific kind of lesson, either for or against the first principles, and helps define the main fulcrum, the main driver.
Yeah, I mean, you jest, but I actually think that the Fellowship is a really good metaphor for the Sovereign Alliance, because it's these independent characters who are all acting in their own best interest, their own self-interest, and their own self-interest happen to all align because they're all trying to defeat the same enemy, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of those things where the even in Lord of the Rings, they're literally all coming from their own races and nations with all their own histories, and they're at the Council of Elrond, and they're not getting along, and they're at each other's throats. It's nowadays it's become such a classic storytelling refrain, but at the time it was fairly new to be doing that kind of thing and have these different representatives. And a lot of how you and I frame the Sovereign Alliance is in talking about not just what we think is going on now, but why it's so thematically impactful given the histories of some of these places. And I know that you talk about, in particular, the Middle East a lot, and Saudi Arabia, and it's not just that, that they would be an important player if there was such a thing as a sovereign alliance. It's that they're even more important because of the history and the subversion that has gone on there. And, my personal rabbit hole was kind of the Russia area, but it's all connected. These days I'm talking about China more than anything else, but I love all of it.
Yeah. And so, the title of the chapter for this evening is Righteous Russia. You obviously, for those who aren't aware, I'm sure most people are, you wrote in 2022, a month before the Ukraine war started, you started a series called Righteous Russia,
which is really what we're going to get into here and talk about the parallels between Trump and Putin, but also the conflict really between Russia and the globalist version of the globalist facet, I should say, of America, because I don't think this is about Russia versus true America, like the America that you and I and most of the audience probably identify with. This is the DC America, right? The elitist America that we've all become very acquainted with over the past 5 to 10 years, and we're all very, very disgusted with. And you know, last week when we were talking about it, I've thought about it a lot since that discussion. And one of the questions I think you asked was like, what role does Putin play in this? What role does Trump play in this? And, you know, it really does seem to me like Trump and the celebrity that he brought to it, like everyone was able, probably all these actors around the world were able to immediately identify with Trump because they recognize, number one, who he was, his celebrity, his background, all of that. He's not like a career politician. But also like he is being targeted by the same apparatus that has been coming after all of them and probably threatening all of them if they don't, you know, get in line and play ball. And when he steps away in January 2021 and Putin steps in and kind of fills that void and then starts bringing all these groups together and forming bilateral agreements and demonstrating that he is actually serious about this, and there's power projection behind this idea of rebelling against this centralized authority. And we saw it in places, we've been seeing it in places like Africa. It really does become a very real, tangible thing for people who understand the story and are able to tap into it. And I feel like that's what you and I have really like been focused on for a couple of years now.
Yeah. Can you hear me, by the way? Because I was on the wrong mic. So shout out to chat.
You sound way better now. I should have said something, but yes,
thanks,
you sound way
Chad.
better now.
Yeah, I was. People were like, "You're in a tunnel." No, I was on the wrong mic. Yeah, I totally agree with that. It actually reminds me of one of the things Oak and I discussed last night on the topic of Trump in particular was sometimes I like playing the game of not analyzing things the way we do, like with all the baggage that comes along with it. We bring so many theories in and we're constantly constructing, we're constantly theory constructing, right? And then we're applying those ciphers to everything that we're looking at. And if they match up, we kind of add it to the database. If it doesn't match up, then we kind of dismiss it. So sometimes I like to play the game of what is this looking like to different layers. I call them layers of the collective mind. What's the normie layer think of this? What's the liberal layer think? What's the traditional conservative layer think of it? What's the deep state think of it? And one of the things Oak and I discussed was Donald Trump, even if you forget everything this audience believes, which is probably that Donald Trump is part of a larger plan, probably that he's part of a plan that's been a long time in the offing and a long time in the planning. If you ignore that, the analysis of Donald Trump by the media, by the globalist media, still doesn't work because, as Oak said, they simply don't consider the end result of his deployments, right? So if you look at the tariff situation right now, if you're a normie and you're not sure if Trump is a 5D chess military genius or some idiot, then all you really should focus on is how often does what Trump say map onto reality? How often does he get what he wants? And it turns out really fucking often, right? So it's a roundabout way of saying that when we talk about things like the Sovereign Alliance, when you just belt it all out to a normie who's got none of the context that we've been building for years in our own minds, it sounds nuts to them to imagine that not only could Donald Trump be a good guy, but that there's probably long-running plans between him and other sovereign leaders. And yet, Chris says this a lot as well, once you start building these frameworks, you can see whether or not that story is more accurately mapping onto the central narrative or not. And I think that the reason that we continue to talk about the Sovereign Alliance idea and flesh it out even further is because the story cycle, the central narrative is more and more mapping onto that reading of things, and it is making less and less sense to read it from the other lens, right? You know, if Donald Trump was really in opposition, if we're really in opposition to Russia and China and some of the things that we're told in the media,
then why is Europe against us? Why is Canada against us? Why are they against Russia? You start to see the pieces kind of orbiting, and once it clicks, once you see it, you can't unsee it, and you just start seeing more and more all these little comms going back and forth. I have a clip that I had Chris at not Chris Paul, but Chris Musgrave at Badlands clip out for me from the show last night, and after Oak was off, I caught myself saying, you're never going to get a press conference where you're going to have these guys just say that they've been friends forever. And then I caught myself because Trump literally said it about Xi a few days ago, right? So, I don't know. Maybe the Sovereign Boys are actually going to get on stage at one point and just be like, guys, did you like that? Did you think that was a good story?
Yeah, it's wild, that because the more I've like dug into the stuff, like even in the Middle East, it blew my mind that because all this stuff happened, and I was tracking this stuff on a daily basis since Trump announced. I was like watch as much as I could, right, with everything else in my life going on. Probably not to the degree that I am now, and certainly not with the right ciphers and with the right like mindset that I have now. But I found a press conference in September 2017 of him and the Sheikh Tamim Al Thani, who's the emir, like the leader of Qatar, in the White House, and Trump sitting there saying, none of these people are going to believe me when I say this, but you and I have actually been friends for a really, really long time. And I'm like, wait, what? And then you go and you listen to Steve Wickoff talk to Tucker Carlson 3 weeks ago, and Steve's like, oh yeah, like I've been friends with all the Qatar guys for like decades. Like I've been very, very, and he's like, and I've also worshipped Donald Trump since like I watched him walk into a room in like the 1980s and just like own the room with his swashbuckling style. Like as a real estate guy, I was like, man, I wish I could be that guy, And then you have all these other advisors who are all like Lebanese guys, like Lebanese businessmen, Saudi businessmen, who are all now playing major roles in the Trump administration, who are all like, oh yeah, like we're American, but we've been friends with all these guys in the Middle East, doing business with them for 20, 30 years. So it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And, again, I think we use the word cipher a lot, and maybe sometimes people don't get what we're doing. And I don't mean that to be condescending. I mean, sometimes it's easy to lose sight of when we're talking about cognitive ciphers and building ciphers to look at the info war. It doesn't mean that we're applying some rule set. Like the way that I think of a cipher is it's a framework. You then you layer the framework almost like an algorithm or an equation over what you're looking at. You take the story that you're looking at, you take the news cycle, you take a given deployment, you run it through various ciphers that you've constructed. And the key with these ciphers is that they've got to be living ciphers, in my opinion. They've got to be movable and mobile. Just like when you go online, for better or worse, the algorithms are always changing, right? Like YouTube's not going to show you the same thing twice in a row. It's going to show you different things. So you've got to apply that in the info war. But the reason we build those ciphers is because once you construct one like the Sovereign Alliance, for example, you can quickly apply a given narrative deployment to that cipher and see if it maps or not. Whereas if you don't have that cipher constructed, if you haven't constructed, okay, if there was an alliance between these emergent nations, or re-emergent nations, I should say, if there was a sovereign alliance, what would it look like? And what would the news cycle look like as it orbited that actuality? That's why building a cipher is important. Just like people in this audience, you're doing it all the time, even when you don't know you do it. If you think that Donald Trump is speaking to multiple audiences when he speaks, you're actually applying a cognitive cipher to everything that he says. And that's just something that's giving you a massive asymmetric advantage over everybody else that's observing those same deployments. They just haven't even considered that he might be saying something more than what, he is on the surface.
Yeah, that's definitely well said. Yeah, I completely agree. All right, well, let's take it back. I want to kick it to you real quick because I do have a little bit of like a history that I want to run through that I think is going to be very enlightening for people to hear. Yeah.
surrounding like the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of Vladimir Putin to the presidency in Russia. But before I get there, I want to go to Righteous Russia and have you explain what was the reason that inspired you to start writing about it, and then just kind of get into like the surface level, like high level stuff of explaining what it is to people for anybody who hasn't read it. And then as we discuss things, I think we'll flush out more of the particulars from it.
Yeah, people, it's funny. So many people like that. I just assumed everybody read it, but it's like every week I'll get somebody that's a Badlands fan or something, and they'll be like, "I finally read your Righteous Russia thing." So if anybody wants to check it out, go to burningbright.substack.com. Righteous Russia series is how it started. That's how I got involved in all this kooky nonsense that we're doing around these parts. And one of the things I said actually to Oak on the narrative is that on that show, I want to construct conversations that are not solely pegged to that specific informational timeline, that you could actually refer back to and look at or revisit and maybe get something out of. So if you think like, okay, the Righteous Russia series was written in 2022, maybe it's not relevant anymore. I find myself revisiting it sometimes to sort of see where my head was at. And I sometimes kind of take new things out of it. And the reason is, Ghost is a historian, Matt Ehret's a historian, and that's not how I approached that series. I approached it as a storyteller. I'd been following the info war for years. I'd been passively observing it. I'd been doing my own research. But for whatever reason, in late 2020 or 2021, I started to just experiment with applying narrative structure to the news cycle. Because at that point, anybody who's in this audience, during COVID and lockdowns and all that shit, you were probably all the way down the rabbit hole of understanding that the news was fake and, they were lying about everything, right? And I started to go, okay, well, we know that, and we've known that for years, but how do we kind of orient ourselves in an informational battle space where they're lying to us all the time? So what I started trying to do is create cognitive ciphers that were specifically applying the tenets of storytelling, 3-act structures I've talked about quite a bit on shows, character ciphers, different plot arcs, etc. And while I was doing that, I was just writing notes down of like who would occupy what role in this narrative. I was actually trying to reverse engineer enemy narratives. So I was trying to guess the future based on what the enemy media, the mainstream media, was seeding. And I started to get a more accurate sort of mental framework of what was going to happen than watching the news earnestly or even paying attention to conspiracy theorists or truth community people, because I found that truth community people were very focused on what was going on right now, like the past and right now. And I was trying to focus on, well, how do we figure out what they're going to do next? And that's when I kind of started laying out some of the foundational narrative terminology, such as seeding, etc. And anyway, January 2022, it had all piled up for me, and I was looking for what is the next major deployment that is coming. And I thought it's Russia. Russia's the next deployment. They had already done the Russia collusion hoax. We know that. They did the Russia thing. I found the way Donald Trump engaged with those narratives to be really interesting because he was almost playful about the whole thing. So I started the Righteous Russia series in January of 2021. I wrote part 1. I essentially laid out my theory that, when the Q drops mentioned the rhetorical question, are Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and Xi Jinping working together against a common enemy? So, I'm paraphrasing. I said, okay, well, let me just apply that. What would it look like if that was going on? And most people at that point in time in the truth community were saying, nothing's going to happen in Ukraine. This is all bullshit. Like, this is fake, blah, blah, blah. And I said, no, actually, Putin's going to go into Ukraine and it's going to be a good thing. And the media is going to spin up a narrative unlike anything you've ever seen about how this is World War III and this is the Third Reich. And that started me down the rabbit hole. So I did it. I published that series, or I started it 6 weeks before the special military operation in Ukraine kicked off. Another very prominent Anon, who is on Twitter all the time these days, just regurgitating normie takes, ripped the whole series off essentially and started tweeting takes from it 2 months later, and got like 500,000 followers on Twitter, as you do. And unfollowed me after all of his followers told him, like, that sounds a lot like the Righteous Russia series. So we all know who I'm talking about. If you've been in the business, you know who it is. I'm not the only one he's done it to. But started doing that. And, before I go too much longer, I guess the baseline, my intention on Righteous Russia was not to figure out the truth of Russia, because it's very hard to do that. It was simply to reverse engineer the enemy narrative in the current battle space, which was 2022, and to take that further back and examine the story of Russia that the Western mind had been told for the last 100 years, and then to map that onto an alternate reading of the globalist establishment and the deep state and say, does this match up with reality? Or is it possible here that we as Americans and we in the West have completely missed something that's been right in front of our eyes the whole time? Nowadays, it's almost trite or simple to say that Russia is our ally in this community. But you say that to a normie, even a normie Republican in 2025, and you're going to get some weird looks. So I think we have still a ways to go. But there's a lot of different rabbit holes I went in at that time. And I'm more firm than I ever have been before that if these people aren't good people and good guys and bad guys, Russia is very aligned with the global vision of Donald Trump. And in my personal opinion, Xi Jinping is as well. And I do think that those are the three major world-moving levers that are at work. And then there are other important figures that orbit them. But without them, none of this happens. You don't have one of those three, and you're not going to reorder the world toward this multipolarity that we're seeing develop. It's just not going to happen if you're missing any one of those three.
Yeah, no, that's well said. Wait, am I okay? No, I'm not unmuted. That's well said. Like early 2022, before I discovered your series, I think I discovered Devolution, like John's series, around like May or June of 22, and then started listening to a show and got familiar with you. But I was in like like everyone else, we all got kicked off of all the different platforms. And through a friend, I got plugged into a Telegram, or not a Telegram, a Signal chat group, and there just were a lot of different people from Virginia in this group. And so there were some State Department guys in there, guys who were Trump supporters, right? And I would get into like intense arguments with these guys about Russia, where I was like pro Putin, and they were just like, dude, you're an idiot. You have no idea what you're talking about. Like, Putin is evil. He's a bad, just
he poisons people. Ghost, didn't you know?
Yeah. It's just
like a Bond villain.
I look back and I'm like, man, I should have been so much. I mean, as firm as I was in my position, I should have been even more firm. I should have been like, no. Not only do I think that Russia is the good guy in this, I think Putin is actually, like you said, the most right. That's the best word I could come up with. The righteous actor here, because I actually think that everything that he's battling against, specifically in Ukraine, that's like the manifestation of it all. The things that they're going after in Ukraine are evil, and it's not just evil in the sense of like, I mean, it's evil in every sense of the word, from what I can gather from what I've looked into, and you kind of capture that in your series.
Yeah, and maybe we can get into that in a little bit. I mean, we could go through a bit of a progression if you want to. We could toss it back and forth, but I broke the series into parts, and I guess maybe to start with, you use the word righteous there. The reason I called it Righteous Russia, yes, people who follow me understand that I am prone to alliteration. I enjoy it. It's satisfying. But I actually did choose that series name for a reason. When I was trying to kind of story construct or narrative construct, I play with, before I actually put something out there, contrary to popular belief, I do run it through psychotic filter of various readings of what's going on out there. That's how I kind of developed the idea of bicameral thinking. Again, I'm not the only person who does this, but just for my own version of this, split my mind into multiple rails, multiple layers, and I like to follow each of those rails down and see where they lead. So when I was trying to narrative construct on Russia, the Righteous Russia title was the end result of that. I'm not saying that I'm the end-all be-all authority here, but as Ghost said, with Putin and Russia being the righteous actor, I named that. I didn't name that series something that's enigmatic or something that's like open to interpretation, or what I see. I call it tiptoeing. I see a lot of that, not just in the truth community, but kind of in the alternative media, where you're starting to see some of them tiptoe out onto the ledge and go, maybe Russia's not totally evil. And to that I say, stop being a pussy, right? Like, if you're starting to go down a rabbit hole, go down it and see what you find. And be honest if you don't know what you found, right? Like, I'm honest about that. We're all honest about that. But what I found, to my personal satisfaction, and I really feel this way, as Ghost just said, I truly believe that the Russian element is righteous in what they did in 2022. I'm not, the only like normie alt media person I saw start floating some of this out a couple of years ago was maybe Dave Smith, the libertarian that was on Joe Rogan. He at least was more honest on the mainstream about how the conflict started and some of the origins of the conflict in Ukraine. But even he does the tiptoeing libertarian bullshit of, I'm not saying Russia's good. Well, I am saying Russia's good. I'm saying Russia's good, okay? And that was the point of the series. Now, I'm not naive enough or stupid enough to get caught in these dumb word games about whether or not Russia as a nation has always been good, because it's such a dumb straw man argument that people make against Russia, which is probably a lot of the things you were dealing with in that Signal chat that you mentioned. Well, guess what? The United States invaded the Middle East, and we were the baddies, right? But we're not dumb enough to all think that the United States is bad because of what was going on there, right? We talk about the deep state, we know it exists, and that's really, after I had a pretty firm belief that Putin was working with Trump and started to look for evidence of that. Most of my research at the beginning of that series was on the history of Russia that, as an American, we are not taught, and I was not familiar with to a large degree. And I had an intro to the series, but in the real part one, it's called The Three Stories of Russia, and the intent there was to lay out. So many people will read that series, and in the comments section, they'll say, I had no idea about that, about Russia. The level of subversion and strife and catastrophe that has been visited upon them by communists, dictators, socialists, Prussians, you name it, Bolsheviks, is absolutely staggering to the Western mind if you start looking at it. And I think when you have that background of what's been done to Russia for the last 100 years and what's been done to the Russian people since the murder of the Tsar Nicholas and his family, everything else starts to fall into place in such a strange, straightforward way that the only thing I could title that series after going down those rabbit holes was Righteous Russia, of saying, not only do I believe that Russia was justified in what they did in 2022, I believe we are lucky in the West that Putin did not do something sooner, because if he had, given the Western leadership at the time, we were going to be fighting Russians and killing each other. That's what the Clintons wanted. That's what the Obamas wanted. That's what the Bushes wanted. And to me, the biggest marker, the biggest indirect proof of the Sovereign Alliance is the The devolution theory perfectly, to me, proves that Donald Trump mostly got off the stage not for the American awakening. I'm in the minority of this. I actually believe that the prime objective was to allow some of these foreign nations, specifically Russia, to clean up the situations it needed to clean up without Trump taking the blame for it. Oh, you're muted.
That's well said. That's well said. And I think that kind of tees up the first thing I want to talk about, which is the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rise of the period between the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of Putin is an era that I think is best conveyed through what was called the Aluminum Wars. Mm-hmm. And so in 1991, you had the collapse of the Soviet Union. You had all these oligarchs. Well, you didn't really have oligarchs. You had these KGB guys who had access to intelligence, and intelligence, in a lot of ways is a great form of power projection. And they also had resources at their disposal. And so this competition quickly erupted about privatizing, because the Russian government was trying to privatize all of these resources across the Soviet landscape. And so these KGB agents, these KGB officers started fighting one another to basically consolidate those resources under their umbrella, under their corporate umbrella, and effectively become oligarchs. And this is what led to the first rise, or the rise of the first wave of Russian oligarchs. Now, oligarchs had existed in Russia for a very, very long time, centuries. Yeah. Certainly under the Soviet Union and under communism, that wasn't anything different. But this was something a little different. And so as I understand it, what the Russian government did is they offered these vouchers to Russian citizens to buy shares in these emerging these companies that were invested in resources. Aluminum and rare earth metals were the number one resource coming out of Russia at the time, or the thing that Russia really had to offer. And a lot of these resources, by the way, were in Ukraine. And so you had Ukrainian oligarchs, you had Ukrainian guys who were involved in this, Georgian guys as well. And then you had different mafia groups that were, some of them were ethnic, some of them were, most of them were ethnic, but, Ukrainian mafia, Georgian mafia, Russian mafia, Jewish mafia. Eventually it became the Israeli mafia. At the same time, in 1991, and this is probably a different episode of the show, but you had a huge influx of Russian Jews leaving Ukraine and leaving Russia, going to Israel, and actually the guy who was helping to facilitate that migration of these powerful players was Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father. And he explained to all of them, look, guys, Israel, and he knew this from decades of doing business there, but he said Israel, because they want capital investment in their country, they have the most lax banking laws out there. It's the best place to go to launder your money. So go to Israel. And so all of these gangsters were going to Israel in the early 90s. That's a big part of this, but we won't probably go too deep into that tonight. But I want to share my screen. So these vouchers are offered to the Russian people. Each one is worth $25. And what these KGB guys do is they come in and they offer people far less money than that to buy up all their vouchers, because people are poor and they're desperate for money. So they buy up all these vouchers from the Russian citizens that are being given these vouchers by the government. And then they consolidate all the vouchers and then use them to buy these, these mines, these refineries, like whatever it was. And they form these corporations. And so let me share my screen. You weren't going to get out of here without seeing a mind map.
Oh, yeah. The mind map.
Yeah. The infamous mind map. By the way, this is come on. From today, Donald Trump. Oh, wait. I'm not sharing my screen. Donald J. Trump. The best definition of intelligence is the ability to predict the future.
So listen, I'm just saying, and Oak can confirm. He's in the chat. Oak and I, when we were talking about Donald Trump's leadership last night, and we did get featured on Rumble, so a lot of people were watching it, we said, whenever you're in doubt of whether or not Trump knows what he's doing, look at the fact that he always knows where the story is going.
Absolutely.
That was the key theme. If there was a theme of the narrative episode 18, it was Trump's ability to predict the future. And we talked about that throughout the episode. And I don't know. Trump's coming out here with his future comms. So
yeah,
maybe a nod to Oak there.
Yeah, for sure. So there are 4 guys that are kind of considered, well, 5 really, but so we'll just say 5 guys who are really considered this first wave of oligarchs that form from the aluminum wars, from the early days of it, like between 1991 and 1994, and that would be Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and his company is Yukos, which is a oil company. Vladimir Olegovich Potanin, and that's Nornickel. That's a nickel company, so a rare metal company. Boris Berezovsky, and he's like a media oligarch, so his company was Channel One. He also formed, it says here, he helped fund Unity, which is the political party that would form Vladimir Putin's first parliamentary base after he was elected in 1999 to the Duma. So it sounds like this guy was kind of like helped kind of form the base for Putin's rise to power. And then the 2 that I think are the most relevant to the current story would be Roman Abramovich. His name has been all over the place since Trump came into his first presidency. He was very much involved in what was going on in Russia, both good and bad. He was on Putin's good side and bad side. His company, Sibneft, I think is what it was originally was called, and then it's now known as Gazprom. And anyone who's been tracking the news over there has probably heard that name, Gazprom. But that's an oil and gas company operating in Russia and Ukraine. And then this guy, this is the most relevant name for sure, Oleg Deripaska. I mean, how many times did we hear his name spoken on Defected over the past few years? Because he was a central player in the Russiagate series. He's the guy who set up Paul Manafort in that meeting, and where allegedly $10 million was offered for access to Trump's White House. And so Deripaska, of all the people, Deripaska is actually considered I think you have that video that we played last week. If you can't,
I could play it. Yeah, I got it. I always got it ready.
Let's go ahead and play. Let's play it in a minute. Let's play it in a second because I think that's very relevant for this story. But Oleg Deripaska is widely considered the winner of the aluminum wars. He's the guy who came out as the richest man in Russia at the end of the 90s. He had a company called Rusal, which was an aluminum company. And I'll kind of get into what happens with him in a minute. But let's go ahead and play that video. Let me share your screen.
Yeah, this is one of my favorites of Putin here.
Vladimir Putin strode into town.
Почему раньше здесь не было людей, которые способны были принимать решения? Почему здесь-то забегали все как тараканы перед самым моим приездом?
Unlike Medvedev, Putin confronted the factory owners.
Считаю, что вы сделали заложниками своих амбиций, непрофессионализма, а может быть просто и тривиальной жадности. Тысячи людей. Это абсолютно недопустимо. Если собственники договориться между собой не смогут, то единый комплекс все равно будет восстановлен. В том или в другом виде, то это будет сделано без вас.
He demanded the owners, including billionaire Oleg Deripaska, sign an undertaking to restart the factories.
Вы подписали этот договор? Да. Олег Владимирович подписал? Что я не вижу вашей подписи? Идите сюда, подпишите. Идите ко мне. Этот договор.
Classic Putin.
Yeah, I mean, you get the idea there, and Ghost can go into more details on it. But I think just another way to frame all of this too, of what you're going into the details, is that one of the things that blew my mind when I was researching Putin in particular with the Righteous Russia series is I think the Western mind broadly understands that the Soviet Union collapsed, right, in the late 80s, early 90s. And then we had the Russian Federation, right? And that's like how we got Putin. The 90s represents essentially an oligarchic gang war taking place over what would then become the Russian Federation, which was essentially a mob war that was being fought between the oligarchs, as Ghost said, that were in power during the Soviet Union, the survivors of essentially the collapse there, all scrounging and scrambling to try to fill the power vacuum. And on a very broad sense, things actually got worse for a lot of the Russian people during this period of chaos, where Soviet communism was replaced by cronyism, crony capitalism. They had no middle class. They had been devastated during the Soviet Union. And instead of being thrust into, a republic right away, they were basically thrust into this gang war where people had to scramble to try to find the closest oligarch to pledge to and work for to feed their families. And as Ghost said, a lot of it had to do with materials, raw materials, and whoever controlled that industry, whoever had political connections. These post-Soviet officers, military officers, and KGB were all trying to fill the power vacuum. So you had a mix of business leaders and and military assets that were all trying to brand themselves as nationalists to the Russian people. And Putin emerged at the end of that. And, just to set you up, Putin, as he was described by the West in the late 90s, they described him as essentially the winning criminal, the winning gangster to emerge out of all of this military and oligarch jockeying. And you're allowed to believe that if you want, but you've got to keep in mind who are the people painting him that way.
Yeah, exactly. And you got to love that video of Putin, like, give me my pin back. I mean, obviously classic, but at the beginning when they say Medvedev, that his name is such a nightmare to say, but he's actually one of Putin's advisors now. And I forget his exact role. I think he's some sort of envoy, I think, to the West. But he's the guy who always comes out very, very like hard against the West and talks about like he was the one who was talking about nuking London, nuking New York, nuking Paris and DC if we have to. But he was president of Russia from 2008 till 2012. Like there was a time period where Putin wasn't in charge, and then Putin came back. And it sounds like they said unlike Medvedev, Putin is actually going after these factory owners now.
Yeah,
and so that would mean that video would have been post 2012. Mm-hmm. And but going back to the 90s, so these two guys are two examples of straight up just Russian gangsters. These guys are straight up from the Russian mafia, Russian/Jewish mafia. And that would be, I can't even say this first guy's name, but Ivankov.
Vyashalev.
Yeah, there you go. Ivashalev, Ivankov, and Mikhail Mikhailovich. And what's actually really funny about the second guy is as I was like searching for just like a bio on this guy, this was like the first article that came up was from 2021. It says an early business associate of Putin's chef Prigozhin has a recent business with several Trump advisors. And it's talking about this guy. It's talking about that Mikhail guy, of course. And that's one of the things that's so funny is that all of these like gangsters and stuff do have connections to Trump. But I mean, like you and Kyle talked many times about the Atlantic City casino and how it's like Trump like put his arms around these gangsters and like brought them into the casino and was like, yeah, come here and gamble and like run your operations out of here. Absolutely. A lot of those guys, by the way, most of them actually were all Ukrainian. That was like the Ukrainian mafia.
One of the speaking of ciphers that we've kind of been talking about, one of the ciphers I kind of early kind of constructed during the Ukraine ops when all that went hot and the media was just bloviating about how evil Russia was and how righteous the Ukrainians were the whole time. One of the narrative deployments that they would use all the time was Russian oligarch, right? We've seen those two words side by side tens of thousands of times in the media cycle since 2022, right? It's not like those words were unheard of before, as we're talking about, but they sent that into warp speed in 2022. And I got into the habit of tracking a lot of these oligarchs anytime they would come up. And the funny thing is, this is why I often say the media doesn't lie often in the way that a lot of our community sort of thinks they do, right? Trump calls it fake news, and we know they're career liars. But one of the things I say in my writing is the best lies are gilded in the truth, and they're the most effective lies. So the media will often tell you that such and such Russian oligarch is embroiled in some sort of illegal scheme. Now, it's possible that that illegal scheme is just something that affects the globalist deep state, so that's why they don't like the guy, right? But often, they're being honest with you about that Russian oligarch. But if you look into that Russian oligarch, to Ghost's point, you'll often find that he's not really Russian. He's ethnically Russian, but he has Ukrainian nationality and is not allowed in Russia. So if you kind of you can kind of play a game after the show, maybe start Googling around some of those headlines that you probably saw the last few years about Russian oligarch's yacht. That's one of their favorite headlines. A such and such Russian yacht, the oligarch's yacht was seized here, it was seized there. You know why they're on yachts, guys? Because they're not allowed in Russia.
Yep.
The Russian oligarchs that are all friends with Vladimir Putin, that the media is telling you are these criminals, are not allowed in Russia. That's why their assets are being seized. So with a lot of these things, we have to fill in some of the blanks ourselves. We don't know the histories of these people. We don't know where all the ends are meeting, right? But if you see a Russian oligarch get his assets seized by the DOJ, and you believe that Trump controls the DOJ, and you figure out that that oligarch is not allowed in Russia, that might be some gravitational proof there that Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump are coordinating against these oligarchs. But the media gets to not lie when they put that kind of thing in a headline. They know that the headline of Russian oligarchs' assets seized hits the audience with an implication that this must be somebody in bed with the Russian government and loyal to Vladimir Putin, when very often it is the polar opposite that's going on.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something that actually Matt Arrett, my co-host on Breaking History, has said so many times, where he's like, these people who are on yachts are actually on yachts because they're not allowed in Russia. So
yeah,
that's why they're living on a yacht and their helicopters flying back and forth. It's because they're in international waters, so they don't get arrested.
You can learn some things watching some Bond movies, right? Like, there's a reason the Bond villains are always in international waters. They're not hanging out in Moscow usually, unless you're talking about the 60s. But they got a little more subtle about how evil the dastardly Russians were in the 80s and 90s.
For sure. So, aluminum wars, 94 to 97, you get this, things turn very violent. You get a lot of bloodshed. You get a lot of like crime wars in the streets. And the focus is really on these smelters, these smelting refineries. And that's actually what we're kind of seeing. I've been tracking the stuff happening with DR Congo lately, and what these terrorist groups, who I think are being funded by, what we would call the globalists, who lost their resources in the DR Congo because Trump froze them under Executive Order 13818 in 2017. What they're focusing on is they're going after the cities. There's a vast mining region. It's the entire eastern region of the Congo. And instead of going after the mines, they're going after the cities where all the refineries are. And that's because you go mine the stuff in these mines, and then you have to bring them to the smelter in order to refine it into the raw material that's then taken to the market. So by controlling the smelter, by controlling the refinery, you don't have to worry about controlling the fields, controlling the mines themselves. And so that's where a lot of the focus, it seems like, shifted to. And these oligarchs then, 1996, there's an election. Yeltsin is running. So all the oligarchs throw their money behind Yeltsin in exchange for political favors, political protection. But I want to turn to Putin in his own words now. So between, I think it was 2015 and 2017,
Putin had 4 meetings with Oliver Stone, and he did 1-hour interviews. And I really encourage people to go watch these interviews. They're worth your time. You'll learn a ton about Putin.
Yeah.
One of the things he explains is that when he came into power in 2000, is that he prioritized burying the hatchet with the West. So he prioritized. He was like, more important to me than anything else was I wanted Russia to basically like reset relations with the West. I wanted us to be friends with America. I wanted us to like enter the global economy and be able to like be a real capitalist nation. And he describes at some point, not the part we're going to watch here, but he describes at one point offering to develop a missile defense array with America. So that would be the end of the Cold War, because if everyone has the same missile defense technology, nobody can fire nukes at one another, right? And he said that even though George Bush Jr. was the president, it was actually George Bush Sr. who told him to pound sand. Who he was the one who had the final word, because he was, of course, the godfather of the deep state. And it was him who said it was actually the father, George Bush, who told me basically to, go jump off a bridge. But yeah, we weren't going to do that. Now, by the way, Russia, and he says that in the interview, he says, now, by the way, Russia has better technology than America does, because we focused on that stuff a lot more than America did. America kind of just left that to the defense industry. And I mean, we all know how, we don't know how that works, but we all have seen how they exploit the whole system and basically sell weapons to both sides. And there's no guarantee that America has the best anything, because everybody's going to become their buyers, and the people who are committing the most violence are going to be their best customers.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the I think one of the things you learn when you start digging into all these things, and you've done it a lot with Saudi Arabia as well, I think this audience would be most familiar with digging into Trump and his history, even recent history, last decade or so. People that are in the truth community, they believe that there's a military plan that Trump's a part of, etc. When you're hit by kind of normie, innocent questions, maybe naive questions of, well, what does that mean when something bad happens? I mean, how many times on the Power Hour, how many times on Badlands over the last few years, especially during the Biden administration, are we questioned about, well, you're saying that there's a plan, whether you're a Q person, whether you're a devolution person, etc., or both. But how can that be the case when I'm being told that this bad thing is going on? And ironically, I think you can we would usually respond to that in this audience and say, well, the enemy gets a vote, right? Oak said that last night as well. The enemy gets a say. This isn't just something where you flip a switch and like, oh, we're in control right now. I understand there's the full control arguments. I interpret that a little differently. I think Ghost agrees largely, and I might even think that there's more control than Ghost does. But that doesn't mean that no matter how far you think control goes, you are incorrect if you think that literally everybody in the government is marching along to the beat of one specific drum, or in the military, etc. They may have full control over outcomes. They may have full control over national essential functions. It is impossible. It is anti-biblical to even believe that there is any possible way that anybody has full control over all variables on a game board in reality. It is not possible. John doesn't have full control of Badlands Media in terms of what we say on the shows. Nobody does. You don't have full control of your own house. Never mind thinking naively that every single person down the chain that is making any decision that could affect people in a country is all operating under the exact same framework. It's impossible. But with that said, Putin's an interesting one to explore through some of these old clippings and everything, because you can start to apply the same framework to what Donald Trump has been dealing with and understand, okay, well, that's why it's silly to say Russia good, Russia bad, blah, 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 especially when there's this whole gray area of the 90s and early 2000s, because you understand that in order to avoid a total collapse of Russian society and government institutions, there's some ball playing that has to go on here. There's a certain number of oligarchs, as we played the Deripaska clip, that need to be brought to heel. There's other ones that I bet Putin thought he brought to heel, and then maybe right when they thought they saw a little bit of daylight, turns out he didn't have them under control. And I think this community has seen that when it comes to Trump, that there's probably been people that, I don't think that Trump is affected all that negatively when he's had betrayals in those around him. But I do think that there's been some people who he's given chances to that have betrayed him. And that he then goes, all right, hey, I gave you the chance. So now we're going to move on to the next one. A lot of that's been going on in Russia, maybe most obviously, because they really were operating as this oligarch crime, mafioso type of situation. So that's what Putin was navigating, right? He comes out of that. And I think even the Western normie mind, if they're accurate about anything with Vladimir Putin, it might be that he is understood to be a pragmatist. He's a very pragmatic leader. And maybe that means that Putin is willing to get in bed with people that Trump wouldn't. Maybe the situation in Russia, as bad as the US has been, we've been a lot more stable. And Trump was coming into a much more stable situation economically and governmentally than Putin was inheriting. So if Trump was inheriting a much worse situation, it might be that he would have compromised with some figures that we wouldn't want him to originally.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. And to your point about like the control thing, I mean, to assume that you could have full control over every single human in a situation, no matter how big of a scale you're talking about, whether it's Badlands Media at a very small scale or the U.S. government or, what have you, the entire international affairs of all the players in every country participating. That is such like a defiant, flippant attitude about like you said, the biblical nature of human nature and how not even God himself has control over all human nature. So how could possibly
free will, except for when it comes to the plan?
Yeah, exactly. And I actually think, I mean, the way I view it is, if you want to think of it like that, that level of control, there's game theory, and there's actually a huge benefit to human nature and leaning into that and getting people to act in their best interest, both for either to expose them as the people, as the criminals that they are, or to get them to go along with something that is ultimately going to be a net benefit for their respective country. Does it make more sense to form the sovereign alliance by holding a sword to everyone's throat and being like, you're in this alliance now? Or does it make more sense to demonstrate to them through a series of actions, through a story that's being told, that they're going to say, okay, you know what? I actually trust you now. And I don't know if we're going to succeed, but you give us the best shot for a brighter future. So we're with you. Like, that's a much more effective, I think, outcome and a way to forge that alliance than to hold a sword to everyone's throat and be like, hey, I'm in full control. You better go along with us or else.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would also say that if I want to give any leeway to the opposite reading of that, I think we're seeing a little bit of it with Donald Trump right now. One of the things I like the most about how he's dealing with the tariff situation and the trade war from a narrative level is at some point, I often use the power is power refrain. I actually started writing about that in Righteous Russia. It was in part 7. It's called Power. And I was saying that at a certain point in time, when it comes to negotiations, there is going to be an adversary that doesn't cave to the negotiations. And at some point in time, you have to demonstrate that you do have the power to back up your side of the table, right? So in a military sense of the word, that might be kinetic action. I agree with you that you're not going to get, when you're dealing with powerful players, you're not going to get capitulation out of them if you're just going around threatening everybody. It's not going to be a good way to operate. But with that said, one of the ways that you can keep more of these people in line that Trump is doing right now with the trade war, I'm thinking of Canada, the EU, Mexico. The reason they're bending the knee is because Trump started demonstrating rapid fire that he will deploy the tariffs and he will weather whatever social and political storms come on the back of them. And it demonstrates to the people on the other side of the board that he does have the power and he is willing to use the power. So I think that when we go back to Putin and we think about a lot of the relationships with oligarchs and with whoever he was dealing with in the Russian system, in the late 90s and early 2000s, and maybe even today, although he seems to have mostly full control of what's going on in Russia these days. I bet there was a few periods of time where he had to pull the boot out and shove it up somebody's ass.
Yep.
Because, how do you make sure Deripaska gives that pen back? Deripaska knows what happens if he doesn't.
Yep.
And Putin had to have cultivated, if you're dealing with gangsters and KGB assets, at some point in time, you have to cultivate and earn a reputation that what you say, you are capable and willing to forward. So now, on the Sovereign Alliance front, when you get those kind of guys in the same room together, a Vladimir Putin, a Donald Trump, a Xi Jinping, a Mohammed bin Salman, and they have common ground, even if they don't agree on everything, those guys would make such great allies because there's no bullshit that's going to go on between them. All of them have had to lean on their respective deep states in their own nations. So I think that when they're in the room together, even if they don't agree on everything, I think that when a dispute arises, they move beyond it quickly because they understand, like, let's revisit this. Let's table this, or let's give him this, and he's going to give me something if I give him this. There's none of the measuring that's going on between these guys because all the measuring has already seen these leaders rise into the respective positions that they're in. So I think it gives them a great deal of trust between each other, not just that they know each other, but that Donald Trump knows the snake pit that Vladimir Putin has navigated to get to where he is. And Vladimir Putin knows that Trump has dealt with the same thing in the West. So I think a lot of trust actually comes out of that. And that they don't have to be using back channels as much as we might theorize. Mm-hmm. They just are keeping the faith at some point in time, like, well, I know what Putin's made of, and I know what his end goal is, so I'm going to trust him on this one.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, if Donald Trump is working with the FBI in the 1980s and running operations against the Ukrainian mafia in Atlantic City out of his casino, you can be damn sure that KGB agent Vladimir Putin is probably aware of that operation like over on the Russian side, right?
Right.
So it's like he knows that Donald Trump is not some spring chicken when it comes to like politics and dealing with extremely violent gangsters, right? And he's willing to walk up to these people, look them in the eye, shake their hand, put his arm around them, and walk into a closed room with them, knowing that he's about to screw them over and entrap them in a law enforcement operation, right? I mean, that takes incredible courage to do something like that. So, and most people would never, like, on their life do that. And by the way, Putin talks about in the Oliver Stone interview being asked by the oligarchs to become president, and he turned them down initially because he was afraid of his children's lives. He's like, these people are going to murder my kids if I do this. That I thought about that all the time. I was worried for a very long time my kids were going to be killed, so I turned them down, and then eventually did do it. I do want to play this clip. This is him talking about Gorbachev and Yeltsin and him coming into power. So let's listen to this for a few minutes.
Серьезные оценки ни деятельности Горбачева, ни личности Ельцина.
Okay, I forgot there's no overdub in this, so I'm going to turn the sound off and I'm going to read what he's saying because I forgot that this is.
Okay, yeah, right.
I don't know why Oliver Stone didn't overdub this with English. That it would have made it far more compelling. But when you watch the interview, you do have to sit there and read the subtitles. So, all right. So he's saying any assessment to Gorbachev of the personality of Yeltsin, just like any of us, he had his problems. Talking about Yeltsin, but he also had his strengths, and one of them was that he never avoided personal responsibility. He knew how to assume responsibility. But then what you said is true. It's no secret. It was also a reality. And so just to set that up, Oliver Stone was talking about how Yeltsin was like known to be an alcoholic, and he had like serious drinking problems, and that like affected his leadership, and that affected his ability to basically keep these gangsters under control. And like people respecting him and everything. And so that's what and like the ability to keep a sharp mind when you're pounding alcohol all the time. So, and then it says, and so this is
they
Boris.
Can't hang like the Irish. They can't hang like ghosts. No, I think the Russians can hang.
Yeah, for sure, right? So this is Boris Yeltsin in 1999. There's a video of him, and this is publicly aired. And it says, I am leaving. Leaving before the end of my term. I realize that it's what I have to do. Russia has to start a new millennium. See if I can get this going any faster. With new politicians, new faces, with new, clever, strong, energetic people.
Minister. Now what?
It says, yes, you know, it's a curious story. You see, I came to Moscow from Leningrad. And on the whole in Moscow, I didn't have any strong support, no contacts. So he spent his career in Leningrad, which is, we now call it St. Petersburg. But he spent his career in St. Petersburg. That's where he had all of his like political contacts. He didn't really have any contacts in Moscow. So then he says, I came in 1996, and on January 1st, 2000, I became acting president. I don't know why Yeltsin chose me, but when Yeltsin offered me the job for the first time, I refused. Yes, he invited me into his office and told me he wanted to appoint me prime minister. And he wanted me to run for president.
Just like
and I
that.
told him that was a great responsibility. And that it meant I would have to change my life. And I wasn't sure I wanted to do that.
You've already been a bureaucrat in the government for a long time.
Well, it's a quite different story. It's one thing when you are a bureaucrat, even a high-level one, you can almost live an ordinary life. You can see your friends, go to the cinema and the theater, and not assume personal responsibility for the fate of millions of people and for everything that is going on in the country. And to assume responsibility for Russia back then was a very difficult thing to do. Frankly speaking, I didn't know what President Yeltsin's final plans were with regard to me, and I didn't know how long I would be there. But because at any moment the president could tell me, you are fired. He's talking about being prime minister. And there was only one thing I could do. I could think of: where to hide my children. Surely, how do you think I felt? Just imagine if I were dismissed and I didn't have any bodyguards, nothing. And what would I do? How would I live? How would I secure my family? And back then I decided that if that was my fate, then I had to go to the end. And I didn't know beforehand that I would become president. And there was no guarantees of that.
Do you see his children during this period and his wife?
Well, I came home very late and I went out to work very early. He's being asked how often he got to see his family. Well, of course, I saw them, but very shortly. I never woke up at 4 a.m. I would go to bed at 12 a.m. or 1 or 1:30 a.m. It sounds like us, BB. And wake up at 7 a.m. I always slept for 6 or 7 hours.
Is this a discipline from military, from your KGB experience?
I think it's that to sports and the military service, of course. Yeah, and then he starts talking about mixed martial arts and
it was a Russian Sambo black belt.
But dude, I could keep playing this, and I think like we would all get sucked in, because that's literally how the whole 4-hour interview is. Like, you just keep getting sucked in, and it's great because the fourth part is after Trump gets elected, and so it's like early 2017. So they're talking about Trump, but it's a fascinating interview. You hear him talk about it right there. He's describing Yeltsin asking him to be prime minister. So he's not even talking about being president yet. 1999, he's asked to be prime minister. And when you hear what he says right there, what he says is, if I was going to do this thing and I didn't I can't start it if I'm not going to finish it, because if I start it and don't finish it, I could be thrown out of office. I lose all my security, and then I'm dead.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
what does that remind you of? Like President Trump running for president. I mean, imagine if he didn't have devolution in place, if we didn't have all the things that we believe he had in place, and he actually was kicked out of office in 2020, and that was it. I mean, what would happen to his family? What would happen to him? We all saw what was going to happen to him, right? He's going to get shot in the head, and his kids are going to be thrown in prison.
Yep. And, again, Oak and I last night, we discussed a lot of the analogs that we've talked about before, which is between the analogs between the Trump administration, the Trump era, really, and Kennedy. And, Kennedy, my personal reading of why the Kennedy assassination was done in the way it was done. I mean, think of it this I don't see this talked about a lot. It's a bit of a rabbit trail, but Kennedy was dealing and navigating with navigating a lot of the same battle space that Trump is navigating, up to and including relationships with Russia and the military-industrial complex and the deep state, trying to provoke them into war with each other. We've been talking about this for quite a while, right? But something I don't see a lot of Kennedy conspiracy theorists and truthers talk about is, why did the deep state do the Kennedy hit job in the manner in which they did? In other words, if you are the most powerful criminal enterprise in the world, did you have to wait until Kennedy was in Dealey Plaza and, rig this whole situation up and get these shooters in place, etc., to make that happen? Couldn't you have done that another way? And I think they could have. If their end goal was to just kill Kennedy, I think there's any number of ways in which they could have done it. I think the Dealey Plaza op was a mass trauma event that served many different purposes. Number one, they get rid of Kennedy, which was the end goal, right? He was causing too many problems for them. But the big second order effects, they traumatized the nation and demoralized the nation when they did that, which was highly effective. It shot us into the late 60s and then 70s. The Vietnam, that's where the United States lost its soul, was during that era. I wasn't alive during that time, but doesn't take much. It doesn't take a genius to understand that Americans lost their identity during the Vietnam War. Doesn't mean there wasn't some bullshit going on in the wars before that, but that is the first one where the American people were going, I think maybe we're the baddies, or at least we're not the goodies. So that was a second order effect. But another major one that's relevant to this and what you just said about Putin and Trump, it was a generational timeline bomb that the deep state detonated to warn all future patriot insurgents, i.e. presidents, of what would happen to them if they tried to do what Kennedy had tried to do. And the reason I say that is because of how brazen it was and how obvious it was. And one of the things I say often about the Kennedy assassination is it's basically the only thing in the world, the only event that if you ask every person in the world whether or not the official story of JFK is true, they will tell you it's not. Now, that's not a bug, in my opinion, of a botched assassination. That's a feature of a mass demoralization campaign and a timeline bomb that the deep state detonated there to warn any future Kennedys that no matter what plan you put together, no matter how good your resolve, no matter how many allies you have, if we have to blow your brains out on national TV in front of the whole nation and sell them a complete bullshit lie that we make up on the spot, we'll do it. And it's just to set up exactly what you said. It's real shit that people like Putin and Trump are dealing with, and hence why many of us believe these guys didn't just come onto the scene. I also don't believe that Putin just came onto the scene. I understand he's telling a story of how Yeltsin asked him to be president and he had to think about it really hard. I think he's telling you bits and pieces of the truth there. I think he's telling you the truth that he did have to strongly consider whether or not he was going to go through with this. But in my opinion, Putin assuming the presidency was not a plan made by just Putin alone, and it was not a plan hatched by Boris Yeltsin. I think it was something longer term in the offing. Just like Trump starts to tell you more and more often these days, as John often points out, he talks about the real generals, not the TV generals. And he talks about if Donald Trump is on 60 Minutes, he's not talking about the real generals that asked him to run for president. He's talking about why he decided to run for president and what his motivations were, right? But that's not true. Well, it's part of the truth. The real truth is that somebody asked him to run that made certain guarantees to him to the best of their ability of what they were involved with. And I think the same thing is probably the case for Putin. I think that he had help, but I think that the risks that he was taking, to your point, were very real.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And that's the kind of the stuff I want to get into before we wrap up here. Before we do that, let's go ahead and hit our last sponsor. And that would be Pet Club. Experience the miracle of a God-given first responder for your health and an ally in your body that fights everything from minor ailments to major health threats. That ally is your immune system. At Pet Club 24/7, we harness the ancient wisdom of nature with our exclusive potent strain of medicinal mushrooms revered for thousands of years of their immune supporting properties that are extremely safe with no additions or overdoses, no side effects, and no interactions with medications. Transform how you manage your health with our all-natural products and help Pet Club change the world one pet and one person at a time. Visit badlandsmedia.tv/pet club now to explore how we're redefining wellness for both pets and people. That's badlandsmedia.com, badlandsmedia.tv/pet club, badlandsmedia.tv/pet club, treating pets and their parents better. And thank you to Pet Club. But yeah, so this is where the story gets interesting, and I think people are going to recognize some of the names I'm about to say here. So what does Putin do with these oligarchs? These guys that are on the screen here that I talked about, that I mentioned earlier, when Putin comes into power, he basically sets up in the early 2000s what he calls rules for the oligarchs, or oligarch rules. And he basically says, stay out of politics or you're going to face consequences. And, not everyone listened to him. They FAFO, right? So this first guy, Khodorkovsky, he ends up getting arrested. He's persecuted and basically is exiled. And he's offered refuge in Switzerland, of course, And he lives out his days in Switzerland. I think he dies in 2013. This guy, Berezovsky, he ends up hanging himself in his house, although investigations lead to the coroner, I think, saying that it was kind of open as to whether it was actually a suicide or maybe a staged suicide, with the allegation not necessarily being that Putin killed him, but maybe that some rival gangsters maybe killed him. But all part of that high-level cartel operation. Because remember, this guy actually was the one who backed Putin and created his parliamentary base at the beginning. These two, Abramovich and primarily Deripaska actually did capitulate after he crossed the line a few times, and you saw that in that video. He capitulates to Putin. Putin, makes use of him and allows him to remain this oligarch. Abramovich is also on Putin's side until actually he invades Ukraine in 2022. And then Abramovich suddenly is on the side of the Western media and is speaking out against Putin. And he finds himself sanctioned by Putin and in Putin's crosshairs. And so he actually lost almost $7 billion in 2022 after he gets sanctioned by Putin. So he people have accused him of being friends with Putin, and he denies that. So he kind of I don't know if he's playing both sides or what it is, but he's at very least he's a gray hat. He's not someone who he certainly doesn't act like he's friends with Putin. He according to him and Putin are not friends at all. Whether or not that's kayfabe, who knows? But
That brings us to this guy, Mark Rich. So Mark Rich is a Swiss banker, Swiss businessman who starts a company in 1974 called Glencore. And we've all probably heard this name. This is a name that I've said many, many times over the past year and a half in my research. But Glencore, of course, is the largest commodities trader in the world. And it says right here, this guy's nickname was the King of Oil. That's what he was called by his business partners. And Andrew Hill, the Financial Times, puts it this way. The quote is, Rich's key insight was that oil and other raw materials could be traded with less capital and fewer assets than the big oil producers thought. And if backed by bank finance, it was a leveraged business model that became the template for modern traders, including Trafigura, Vitol, and Glencore. And what's interesting about those three names is that on my mind map for the past year, I've actually had those three names sitting right here, because those are the three largest commodities traders in the world, and the three companies whose names consistently come up with all of these lawfare cases that are being launched against these CEOs that are exploiting different countries, particularly the two countries that keep coming up in every single case that I've seen: Venezuela and the DR Congo. It's like almost every single time it's either Venezuela or the DR Congo or both. Interesting. Yep. So, and so what ends up happening is Mark Rich, he starts off with like aluminum. That's the company that he creates. He kind of parlays that, and it's called Mark Rich & Co. AG. And he parlays that into creating Glencore. And then this is a diagram that I actually made a month or two ago. Deripaska's company called Sibirsky Aluminum Group merges with Roman Abramovich's Millhouse Capital, which is like a venture capital group. They merged in the year 2000. And then later in 2007, this group merges with Sual Holding, which stands for Siberian Ural Aluminum. The L is, I think, like a Russian word for company. And Glencore International AG, which is Mark Rich's company. So Mark Rich's company merges with Deripaska and Abramovich's company to form what is called it continues to be called Rusal. But here's the Reuters article from 2007. Rusal Sual, Glencore complete aluminum merger. It says Russia's top aluminum producer, Rusal, smaller rival Sual, and commodities trader Glencore said on Tuesday they had completed a merger to create the world's biggest aluminum firm and will list shares within 3 years. The new company, United Company Rusal, has pro forma sales of approximately $12 billion. The group's production capacity is about 4 million tons of aluminum and 11 million tons of alumina, the firms said in a statement. And this is August of 2007. So anyway, this all ties into, like, here's a chart that somebody made. It looks like the Atlantic Council and the Economic Sanctions Initiative created this chart to show how Trump's sanctions against Russia impacted Deripaska specifically in Rusal, and to cut out third-party actors, cut out oligarchs, and basically clean up the aluminum market to make America more competitive. That was one of the few, because there actually weren't that many. If you go back and you look, there weren't that many tariffs that Trump did the first term. He only did like very, very finite tariffs against China. He threatened a lot of tariffs against a lot of people and leveraged that in order to get what he wanted from them, specifically Japan, Canada, and a few others. He did sanction Russia. And then, of course, this is from February of this year. Trump imposes a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum. And that was targeting, again, Russian aluminum, but also Japanese steel, the Nippon Steel Company. And
some of these tariffs, I don't pretend to know where all of them are going, but specifically when it comes to China, one of the major things I've been talking about is that you've got to look at the net effects of a lot of these tariffs and a lot of these sanctions, especially when they're coming from Trump, pass it through those cognitive ciphers that you develop. And specifically when it comes to China, one of the things I've been saying lately is, who are the tariffs actually affecting? Is it affecting United States citizens and Chinese citizens? Or, I mean, who's tucking tail and running? Right now, it's Apple, Amazon, Walmart. Amazon and Walmart just lowered their guidance on the back of the tariffs on China. And Apple announced $500 billion in onshoring, reshoring in the United States due to the tariffs on China. So is it actually affecting China? Or is it affecting the American oligarchy that has been exploiting China? And I think that's a lot of what's going on here, right? When you talk about the aluminum wars, etc. There was, speaking of oligarchs, before we get out of here, one thing that I thought was interesting is in part 2, I think, of Righteous Russia, I went into Putin in particular. And the way I had started that was, do you remember your first experience with anti-Putin propaganda? And I remember mine. And it was a May 2014 episode of Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown I was watching. And it was strange. It was in Moscow, the traveling chef, and it was an interesting episode. But it was strangely political, and it kept kind of leaning into political stuff. And I actually have if you want to share my screen here, I've got a Daily Beast article that summarizes one of the quotes that I had put into the series. Parts Unknown, Russia, May 11, 2014, opens with a montage of anti-Putin protests, followed by Bourdain's voiceover, quote, "No matter how transparently autocratic, vengeful, oblivious to even a thin veneer of democracy, Russians love Putin. They seem to feel about him like New Yorkers used to feel about Giuliani. He may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch." Now, this was anti-Putin propaganda, but they're casting him as a Russian populist. Little did they know in 2014 that Donald Trump was going to put Giuliani to shame in terms of an American populist. And then a figure that is featured prominently in this episode of Bourdain is, speaking of some of these opposition leaders, Boris Nemtsov. He was an opposition leader to Vladimir Putin who features prominently in this episode. On February 27, 2015, Boris Nemtsov, a Russian politician opposed to the government of Vladimir Putin, was assassinated as he crossed the Bolshoi Moskoretsy Bridge in central Moscow. An unknown assailant fired 7 or 8 shots from a Makarov pistol. So what does that remind you of as well? More recently, we've got the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, right? And these are these anti-Putin figures that the Western globalist media propagandizes. And the reason that Parts Unknown episode stuck in my mind is because I remember being a liberal, a disillusioned liberal at the time in 2014. I had kind of flamed out of supporting Obama. And I was not a Putin guy yet, but I was training with Russians, which I've talked about before. And they were telling me about Putin, and I didn't really believe them, but I was like, whatever. These guys seem like good guys. I'll just let them have their little Putin stuff. And watching that episode of Bourdain's Parts Unknown, I started to go, oh my God, what if these Russian boys are right? And the U.S. has been propagandizing its people because the episode had so prominently featured Boris Nemtsov as the opposition leader to Putin and lionized him as this hero of the people and Putin as this propagandist. And then in the credits of the episode, they're like, after the airing of this episode, this many months after the filming of this episode, Boris Nemtsov was assassinated by an unknown assailant, right? So I'm like, did the CNN crew assassinate Boris Nemtsov? I mean, I don't know. I'm just saying that they basically lay out like, here's the opposition leader to Vladimir Putin, and it's very dangerous to oppose Vladimir Putin. And then like the episode is bookended with, oh, by the way, American viewers, this guy was assassinated because he stood against Putin. And as a writer, I just went, this is way too neat. You laid out, you're going to tell me that Bourdain goes to Moscow to film an episode and he happens to feature the episode on Boris Nemtsov, and then Boris Nemtsov happens to get assassinated in very suspicious fashion before the episode airs. Like, obviously it was propaganda, And they got away with it because they didn't just send a CNN news crew to go fluff up Boris Nemtsov in Moscow. They sent an American culture figure, Anthony Bourdain, to go fluff up Boris Nemtsov. And it started to kind of clue me into this is how subversive and how complex the propaganda really was. And of course, the rest is history. They tried to rerun it in 2021, I think, with Alexei Navalny. And man, they didn't even come close to getting the same play out of that storyline as they did with Nemtsov.
Yeah, that's that's interesting, especially the idea that was CNN the one who assassinated him.
Not an allegation. I'm just saying they were there.
Yeah. Well, so the last little thread that I want to hit, and then we'll do rants and get out of here, because I think this is the one that's really that people are gonna remember moving forward. So obviously a character that this entire community is very familiar with, George Soros. So what most people probably don't know is that George Soros opened Societies Foundation in 1990, when Yeltsin comes into power in 1991. He is welcomed with open arms by Yeltsin to bring his NGO, Open Societies Foundation, and his money into Russia. And he ends up spending in that decade, in like the 9 years he was there, or I guess it was maybe 11 years, 12 years, $100 million. So he brings $100 million into the Russian education system and the Russian society. He wants to form the Russian society in his image, and we all know what that looks like, right? And it's obviously very subversive and negative for the Russian people. And so when Putin comes into power in 2000, the first thing he does is he starts to clamp down, using his bureaucratic background and knowing how to work the bureaucracy against Soros. So he starts auditing Open Societies Foundation. He starts putting the pressure on them. He starts investigating them. He starts fining them, and basically makes their existence a living hell. And that all kind of culminates in this moment. This is Los Angeles Times, November 7th, 2003. Financiers Institute in Moscow is raided. It says, in the wake of U.S. financier George Soros' public defense of jailed Russian tycoon Mikhail Khodorkovsky, there you go. There's that first oligarch, the guy that I had on my mind map. The Moscow offices of the Soros Foundation were raided earlier today by dozens of men equipped with camouflage gear and stun guns who hauled away 15 years worth of documents and computer data. The operation, which began shortly after midnight, was carried out by private security forces ostensibly hired by a businessman with whom the foundation had been engaged in a legal dispute. But Soros Foundation officials said they could not rule out a connection to the Yukos oil company case, in which offices throughout Moscow have been raided in recent months by authorities seeking evidence against the billionaire oil tycoon. So remember, I said that Khodorkovsky had legal charges brought against him. He was arrested and ultimately exiled and forced to go live in Switzerland. And so as part of that investigation, Soros's offices were raided. And so what ends up happening is that the Open Societies Foundation ends up shutting down their offices in 2003. They haven't been in Moscow ever since. So this aligns exactly with what you talk about in the Righteous Russia series, where it's like Putin's Russia, it's a fundamental rejection of all the things that we despise in America now at this point, right. The whole woke, like, leftist movement, right? Well, Putin doesn't even put up with it. Within 3 years of him being in office, he's like, you're done. Like, he immediately goes to war with Soros, and he gets him to literally shut down his office and leave Moscow forever. And then what happens after that, I have bullet points here. So then there's a series of reforms. So here it is. So in 2006, the first major NGO law passed to impose tight controls and oversight over foreign NGOs operating in Russia. In 2012, he then passes what's called the Foreign Agent Law, stigmatizing foreign-funded NGOs doing political work. In 2015, 12 years after the Open Societies Foundation leaves Russia, he passes what's called the Undesirable Organizations Law, which allowed banning entire international NGO groups, and specifically they used the Open Societies Foundation as like the poster child of that law. And then between 2020 and 2021, he expands those laws, the foreign agent labels, to include individuals and online content.
And so laws effectively criminalizing foreign support for civil society and like watchdog groups, quote unquote, that are actually probably like CIA funded, like cutouts are targeted by the Russian government and shut down. And so what we've seen over the past year, if you remember last May, that guy, Robert Fico, who was the Slovakian prime minister who was shot 5 times in the chest. The reason he was shot 5 times in the chest was because he passed similar laws in Slovakia, which they call Kremlin laws, Putin laws. And their laws, basically, all they say is that if you're a foreign NGO that takes more than 20% of your funding from an outside, like a foreign source, you have to publicly disclose who your donors are. That's it. That's all it is.
Yeah. And the nation of Georgia, as you've talked about, went one step further and kicked all the NGOs out. And he talked about Fico, the president of Georgia, whose name escapes me right now. But
the guy with the crazy hair.
Yeah. But it's the Kremlin playbook, and it's so funny. It's why I say, when you get comfortable with this stuff and narrative reverse engineering enemy narratives, you can learn a lot by reading enemy narratives. So oftentimes, again, they're not usually lying to you in the way that we've been taught to think they're lying. As Ghost just points out, that's a good example. When they tell you that such and such leader is using Kremlin tactics, they're probably telling you the truth.
Yeah.
It's just that the Kremlin tactics are a good thing. And that's some of that subtlety. You're not going to be able to unsee it once you start seeing, like, wait a second, they didn't actually say that a law was broken here or that anything went on, right? They just said Fico is using Kremlin tactics and Kremlin policies. Well, the implication is that that's bad. But it's not. I wanted to share my screen because you teed it up here. I said this this is actually in Doomed Dynasty, which is my collection on China, but Sovereign Alliance. So I said, even our favorite Sultan Slug himself, George Soros, got in on the Xi bashing in recent months. He did so before the 20th National Congress, and its ensuing fallout solidified his position as leader not just of the China of today, but that of tomorrow, almost as if he knew something was coming. Something is almost as problematic to him as the nationalistic and globalist eschewing and even openly combating rises of Putin and Trump. The only other two world leaders the globalist mega financier has deemed, quote, threat to global democracy in recent years. And you've got the headlines right there. There are 3 men, to my knowledge, that George Soros has deemed threats to global democracy. And those 3 guys are Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and Xi Jinping. And now again, the funny thing about those headlines is that they're telling you the truth. They are a threat to globalist democracy. It's just that we think that that's a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. And on Friday, actually, on my geopolitics show, I didn't really do like a normal show where I cover like a ton of news topics. I really just kind of went into like in depth on one news topic and kind of explained my thinking, like how I like parse through stuff and look at ciphers. Mm-hmm. And as I explained then, I don't really care about what's happening on the ground, like trying to discern like what's actually happening, because who knows what the hell's happening. It could all be just be made up, right? I focus more on the response to the story being told by the high level players, because they will like over a long enough time scale, they will tell you exactly who they are through a pattern of behavior. It becomes a pattern recognition exercise, and you can start to parse who's what. And through that story, it was the relationship between Russia and Sudan, and how the State Department was responding to Russia and Sudan trying to set up a Russian naval base over like a 5 or 6 year period in Sudan. And basically the second that Sudan, like the State Department in 2022 said, you better not allow this naval base to happen. And then in February 23, they were like, yes, we will allow the naval base to happen. And then 2 months later, a totally organic civil war breaks out in the Sudan. And Russia's backing one side. It's like you can figure this stuff out just by understanding like those kind of ciphers. And at that point, you don't really care what's happening on the ground as much as like how are the high level players like responding to everything. So I think it's a good way of looking at things as opposed to trying to figure out exactly what the story is on the ground. So
and this is something Chris talks about a lot as well, is that and we've really tried to hammer it into people, and I think our audience is largely responding. It's not just that narrative warfare is important to learn and to think about, it's, to your point, it's more important to figure out how narrative warfare works than it is to figure out what's actually going on. And it's my personal opinion, and I'm pretty firm on it. Like Chris says the same type of thing, but it is, you are going to waste your time if you are trying to figure out what's actually going on. You are wasting your time.
Yes.
You will never be able to prove beyond your own personal satisfaction what has actually occurred in a given deployment. But you can prove the narrative intent of the storytellers.
Yes.
And that will tell you what direction the storytellers want to move society in. And when I use the word storytellers, I think maybe that's not the greatest term. People think about literally stories. They think about even media articles, and that's part of what I mean. But, even relevant to this show and a lot of what you do on the Book of Trump, Trump is a storyteller. Vladimir Putin is a storyteller. George Soros is a storyteller. That's how they're trying to guide the public mind. And it's hard to figure out who's lying and who's telling the truth. Just like I said, it's hard to figure out what's actually going on. But what you need to do is try to cut to the root first principles arguments being forwarded in each figure's story. So when you bring up Putin in relation to George Soros, and let's say devil's advocate, you don't know who's right. Who's right between George Soros and Vladimir Putin? What is at the heart of George Soros's argument? What's at the heart of his story? Globalism, collectivism, central banking, NGOs. Do you like globalism, collectivism, central banking, and NGOs? Are those the things that are most affected by Putin's counter-narrative, which is all about sovereignty and nationalism? This is why it's not just about the active forwarding of Vladimir Putin's narrative. It's about how that interacts with the opposing narrative. And often the opposing narrative, as you just said, is going to define the active narrative more fully than the narrative can alone. And that's what I did in the Righteous Russia series. And the more that's kind of where I started developing that way of approaching the info war. And man, you take that framework and you start applying it to China, you start applying it to Trump, you start applying it to anything else, and it's going to serve you pretty well to try to figure out what's the intent of the story I'm being told, and then reverse engineer that to who the storyteller is.
That's exactly right. And a really good example I can give of that is Lindsey Graham. Does everyone remember last October, like a week or two before the election, when Lindsey Graham came out and said, we need to go bomb every oil refinery in Iran? Like, it was October 20th, I think maybe October 22nd. Someone can go fact check me on that. That was when Lindsey Graham was openly posting on X saying, we need to go bomb every oil refinery in Iran. And had we done that, we would have found ourselves in a kinetic war with China, who had just signed a oil deal, like a huge oil deal with Iran, where they're getting the majority of their oil now from those oil refineries. And they already had their Navy, by the way, anchored in the Persian Gulf waiting for that attack. And yet Lindsey Graham knew all that, of course. Yeah. But the response to all that was overwhelmingly people shaming him and calling him a moron. And that just goes to show how far we've come over the past 10 years. Where 10 years ago, people would have fallen for that stuff.
Yep.
So it's like, that's a perfect example of pattern recognition, because everybody knows exactly what Lindsey Graham's all about. So when he comes out and he says that, everyone just laughs at him and calls him an idiot, and we move on with our life.
Absolutely. Yeah, and one of the other things that I'll say about Putin that I really respect, we could do a whole year of shows on this stuff, but as a surface level thing, relevant to what you said about Soros, one of the things I really like about Putin that I think Trump is leaning more and more into in his second term, public term, is Putin's very direct with the Russian people. And by that, I know that people in this audience will say that Trump is very direct. I would argue that Trump is more direct now than he was his first term. And I know that some will disagree with that because Trump's always been bombastic, right? He came onto the scene full of bombast, calling people fake news, right? I'm not saying Trump was ever a coward or anything. But when you ask Trump, in fairness to what people on the left say, when you ask Trump a direct question, he never used to answer it. To be honest, he would talk in circles around it, And for a reason, in my opinion, because of the battle space that he was navigating. When they would ask him about something, he wouldn't just say, well, you see, we got this globalist trade imbalance, and this is what we're going to do, and we're going to hit them with these tariffs, and this is how the global trade system is going to be rebalanced, and we've got Scott Bessent working on a new reserve asset, right? Like, that's what he says now. But a few years ago, he would just say, like, it's a flawed system, I'm going to fix it. We're going to bring manufacturing back. It would be all very broad-based first principles argument, not a lot of detail. And now Trump is deploying a lot of detail in the narrative. And I think, to Ghost's point of how far we've come, I think you should take that as very encouraging, because it's Donald Trump telling you that they recognize that the normie layers of the collective mind are ready to engage with much more direct, like, this is how tariffs work, guys. And this is what we're doing. This is how we're rebalancing global trade, right? He had to massage that in over years and start with nationalism, good. Globalism, not good, right? But when you watch Vladimir Putin, it's not that the Russian people are smarter. It's that they're further along an awakening timeline because of everything that they've dealt with over the last century that we have not dealt with. So Vladimir Putin doesn't have to get on stage and go, globalism, bad, Russians. He gets to get on stage and tell them exactly who George Soros is, exactly what he's been doing in Russia, and exactly why he's no longer welcome there. And it's kind of it's why sometimes we seem to be really pumping Putin up. It's because he gets to just say what we really wish Trump would say at times, and that Trump is kind of getting closer and closer to saying.
Yeah, exactly. It's like they're a few steps ahead of us on the whatever the board, the game of life.
Right.
I don't know what the right metaphor is, but whatever it is, they're a few steps ahead of us. So we'll get there eventually, but they've just been going through it for much longer because they lived under communism for 90 years. So I think this is probably a good place to put a pin in it. This has been a good conversation. Obviously, it's not an all-inclusive conversation when it comes to Putin and Russia, but the whole point of this was to bring BB on and lay that first foundation, a thick foundation for Putin, because he's going to be a major player in this show moving forward. He's going to come up in most of our geopolitical content moving forward and storylines. He's going to be there. And so understanding his core basis of operation and kind of cutting through all the BS that we've been sold in the mainstream media, I think is really, really important. And understanding that the battles that we're fighting right now with the bureaucracies in DC, he already fought those 20 some years ago and won.
Yep.
And that's why Russia is in such a different place culturally now than we are. I mean, they are a very, very strong Christian nation that also happens to have a very large Muslim population on its southern border, and Dagestan. And that's a great point. We're probably going to have to bring you back to do Dagestan.
Yeah, we'll have to do that, a separate rabbit hole on the Chechen War and interesting stuff there. I love the show. I love the Book of Trump. Obviously, narrative warfare is my whole thing. So I'm loving the way you approach it. If I could, I just wanted to share a couple things before I head out of here.
Of course, please.
To let people know. Well, first of all, the Righteous Russia series. If you guys want to, if you want to share my screen here, if you guys want to catch up on it, I wrote it to be an evergreen series. If anything, you probably get more out of it now than you would have in 2022. Go to burningbright.substack.com. You'll see the intro on the main page there. I think there's like 9 parts, and then I wrote a giant retrospective on it a year ago. So check that out. And I want to let people know, speaking of stories, Badlands Story Hour, tomorrow night with Chris Paul, we are doing Top Gun Maverick.
Hell yeah.
And look at how good this graphic works here. I'm going to hit you with a swerve. We are going to be joined by a special guest to discuss Top Gun Maverick. And that special guest...
No way.
...is General Stephen Quast, the Badlands General. We'll be joining Chris Paul and I on Tuesday night, 9 p.m. Eastern, to discuss Top Gun Maverick. That is an actual photograph of General Quast. I suppose I should have asked him if I could share it, but I did anyway. So this is him. He's going to tell us what's actually going on with Top Gun. He's going to tell us if planes are even real. And I didn't think of it until yet. Like I didn't think of even asking him to get on the show. And then Oak McCulloch was like, "Why don't you have Quast on Top Gun? Like, what are you doing, you dumbass? And I just went, well, I didn't think of asking him. So that should be a fun one. Speaking of stories, I love that movie. And besides the stuff that we'll get into with General Quast for, whatever he's going to bring to the table, illuminate us on Top Gun itself and on the movie. He did tell me in Vegas, we talked about this movie, which is why it was in my mind a little bit. And he said he does consider it to be actually pretty damn realistic in many ways. Of course, they take liberties, which was cool to hear. But on a macro trend, you and I talk about this a lot. Chris and I talk about culture and a lot of that. Top Gun Maverick I see as a signal flare movie in a positive way. It's one of the few movies of the last few years where I think it demonstrated that we are capable of making inspirational, cool American fiction again, and we just need more of that. So that should be a fun one.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I had no idea that that was happening. Great movie, love that movie. I'm glad. I think they held it back when COVID hit and waited for the COVID stuff to pass so they could release it in theaters. I went and saw it in theaters and it was amazing. In theaters, I feel like that was one of the best representations. I'd love to hear General Quast's feedback on it, but you feel unlike any other flight movie I've seen, that one, you feel like you're in the cockpit and it's very, very visceral and very, very well directed. I feel like, and it's a great action movie that we haven't seen in a long time out of Hollywood.
Right.
So
perhaps loosely based on the exploits of General Quast. We don't know. We'll find out.
We'll have to find out. I was gonna say Story Hour is probably my favorite show. One of my favorite shows on Badlands because it's a show that if the InfoWar were to end tomorrow, you could keep doing that show for the rest of the time.
Yeah.
That's a show that just has so much longevity to it. And obviously movies have a very close connection to culture. So there's just a lot of great conversations to come out of it. And the fact that General Quast is going to be on it tomorrow night, in addition to that awesome movie, that's going to be a must watch. So I will, as I typically do, I will be putting links to Burning Bright stuff to his X account and everything in the comments for everyone listening to this on replay. But yes, I'm going to it looks like we have a rant and a boost. So let me read those real quick and then we will get out of here. Babo, I don't know if I'm saying this right. Babu Fu. Man, I'm so sorry. I'm not good at pronunciation and I kind of wear that as a badge of pride. But it's $5. I was 7 when Kennedy was shot. I remember my uncle once saying bad people in government were in charge now. Well, your uncle sounds like a very based, intelligent individual. I would love to meet him one day. Melindy, $5. At what point did y'all realize that modern Russia is not the USSR and or that Putin is based? I think we've answered that question, but
generally, I think it would be when we realized that all the people attacking him were evil, just like a lot of us figured that out with Trump. Similar sort of thing.
Yeah, I'd say in the past 5 years for sure.
Yeah.
And then let's see. Astro Emmy, $17. Open Societies Foundation was in Mongolia in 1996. He went everywhere, did not blame Putin for distrusting all foreign NGO activity back then. Yes, he certainly seemed to have his finger on the pulse when it came to that kind of stuff. All right, and then we have a boost, and the boost is MAGA Girl 4545, $50. Thank you so much. This is from 2 weeks ago because we took last week off. Excellent Vegas shooting show. Great point with JA and his team doing nothing to warn the crowd. I put this in the same category as a fire. If you are in charge of a venue and you see a fire has broken out, you have a duty to let the crowd know. Yes, thank you for that very generous boost. And 2 weeks ago, I had on Zach Payne and G Money to do the Vegas shooting show. And G Money, of course, is a survivor of the that what we thought was a false flag attack, and that provides a very unique chapter for the show. Because certainly woke him up. Yeah, exactly. So we got a firsthand account of what the shooting was actually like, and it was very
little did they know they created a Bitcoin maximalist in that.
Created in a monster, and we absolutely love that monster here on the Book of Trump. So, well. BB, thank you again so much for this. I think this has been a great way to lay the foundation for the Sovereign Alliance because this is going to become, as I said when I started the show, we spent the first 10 episodes or so kind of running through a lot of Trump's background. We're going to do a few more of those as we move forward, but a lot of the show from here forward is going to be a geopolitical show
And now with Putin as kind of like the anchor point for the Sovereign Alliance, we can branch out and really talk about that stuff. So I appreciate.
I'll come back on for Xi because Xi's don't sleep on our boy Xi.
Yeah, for sure. Oh yeah. Xi's another one where it's going to be just like this. He's the other kind of big anchor point. So yeah, man.
All right, man. Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me. Great time.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's see. Do I have the outro? I think I do. Let me go to there and go.
Thank you so much for joining us, and don't forget to hit the thumbs up on this video. And a special thank you to all of our advertising partners. Please remember to shift your dollars to support those businesses that support Badlands Media.